Well, welcome, Mr. Sharif. Welcome to the university.
Thank you.
Thank you for visiting us today. For those who are going to watch this, I just wanted to introduce Mr. Sharif to our audience. Mr. Sharif is a civil servant of more than 4 decades now. I mean, he's joined in 1977. He studied at St. Stephen's College and has a law degree from Delhi University. He's also an alumnus of the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva and from the Kennedy School at Harvard. And he was the first Indian to graduate from one of the ecoles in France. He's worked in various positions at the state and central level, most notably as the Principal Home Secretary of Delhi and as the Chief Secretary of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands when he was responsible for tsunami rehabilitation. He's also been an advisor on the board of directors of the Asian Development Bank. He then, I think, took on a second role thereafter, which is to be a secretary to two of our vice presidents and a president of India. And he's advised them on several constitutional, legislative, and international affairs. In 2011, he was made Secretary to the Government of India and later served as the Secretary General of the Rajya Sabha from 2012 to 2017. More globally, he was on the Executive Committee of the Association of Secretaries General of Parliaments in Switzerland. And he's been associated with the Commonwealth Parliament for some time, and in recognition for his outstanding work, he was made a lifetime honorary member of the association in 2018. So welcome, Mr. Sharif, again.
Thank you.
Why don't you tell us a little bit more about how do you see your career, on hindsight, how do you see the different things that you've played in public service?
Well, thank you for the interview and this visit to the university. It's my very first, and what little I've seen of it is very, very impressive, and the work that has been done. As for myself, with 40 years of, you may say, in hindsight, you get everything. You get the good, the bad, and the ugly as you go along. And I've been very fortunate, primarily because I think I was mentored by some very eminent people, not just the two vice presidents and president, but also in my service career, people with very high ethical and moral standards, which you were taught. And the year we joined service in 1977 was the first year when the emergency had been lifted. So it was a very unique year in the sense that we had to actually get to see what had happened during the emergency and what was expected of us as civil servants and how we would proceed in our career after that. So I think looking back at those years, I would say that it's been a great learning experience. And this learning experience doesn't really end for a civil servant. He continues to learn. And thanks to the Official Secrets Act, you're always on your toes till the very end.
Sure.
So, once a civil servant, always a civil servant.
So one of the things that I was very curious about is because you've been a civil servant for so many years, and you've also had a sort of insider's view about our legislature and our legislators. In public administration, we are always curious about which one would have or which one plays a more meaningful role in the functioning of a democracy, right? So what is your opinion? Is it do you feel that being a bureaucrat was more meaningful, or do you think playing an advisory role to legislators was more meaningful? Which do you think? And I'm asking this in the context of we're 75 years, we're now India's largest democracy, so it's probably a good sort of occasion also to think about questions of democracy. So what is your sense? Do you think who do you think? Which role do you think is more important from where you have seen both roles?
Well, to answer your question, to begin with, you said insider's view. Well, I would say a lot of it is a ringside view, because you see a lot of other people do things.
True.
And insider view, I think, sometimes gets me very worried, because what remains inside,
True.
in that sense. No, but you can't really when you look at a democracy, and a democracy like ours, which is not just the largest democracy in numbers, but also a democracy that has evolved. It hasn't happened overnight, I mean, we had the independence movement and then so on and so forth. And the democracy has always been there in some form or the other. But what has happened is that, the executive, the legislative, and the constitution, they don't really work in silos. So there is always a way in which they do interact, which is not so evident. But the point is, therefore, to say that this is primer to that doesn't really work out. And with my little experience, if I may put it personally, even when I worked in France and in the French government, I was in fact for a short while even seconded to the French government, I find that the same thing is there. And other parliaments, when I interacted, they too have the same kind of feeling that you cannot really differentiate one from the other because each has its own relevance. So in my view, if you look at the executive and the legislature, they are two sides of a coin, if you want to put it that way, because one cannot survive without the other. And in a working relationship, after all, you have to appreciate the fact that in a democracy, there is a legislature, and the legislature is represented through members of parliament or assemblies, even the panchayats, and therefore they actually represent what you call we the people. And therefore, for you in the executive to say you have a primer role or a separate role, it doesn't really work. Because if you work with that mindset, you would never get to what is called the principle of administration, which is harmony. Because in none of these, if you do not have harmony, then you imbalance the system. And therefore, they are complementary to one another. Like any other organization, you will have situations of not conflict, but disagreement. It's how you manage it, how you manage transition, how you manage public dealing. So what public dealing you do in the executive is precisely what you do public dealing when you're working with the legislative, because they also are people who need to be sort of understood. They require your guidance. You require their views in order to, I mean, let's take a simple case. If you're enacting a bill of parliament, and in parliament rather, and it comes across to you, if you had the work experience as in the executive, you would be able to guide them towards making the bill more meaningful and more implementable. Because if it is something very theoretical, it will never work. So I don't really see one being superior to the other or inferior to the other. And I see them complementary, and they have their own red lines. And the Constitution, as a matter of fact, is the frame in which you need to work. Because if any bureaucrat wishes to work, the first question he needs to ask himself is this supported by a legal basis? Because if whatever action you take must have a proper basis. And if you don't do it according to those bases, then you obviously are going haywire. And therefore it is important for you that even when a bill or any other policy issue comes up, you have to listen to the people. How will you listen to them unless you listen to their representatives? So I don't see a conflict as such.
So on the question of we the people, I just was curious about, since you've been the Secretary General of the Rajya Sabha for a long time. So while the Lok Sabha interest represents the interests of the people, I was just very curious, in public perception, the Rajya Sabha or the members of the Rajya Sabha are generally political representatives, at least the way it is perceived, are people who stay above the fray. They provide wise counsel to the passions of democratic politics in the lower house. And they also, I guess, in some sense represent the interests of the states, which is we the states, right? In today's world, and the third thing is that, in many sort of, I guess, the question of whether we need two houses at all, one representing the interests of the people and a different house representing either the states or staying above the fray. In a larger context, do you think bicameralism generally is something that is important? It remains relevant, especially in a parliamentary democracy. I understand, and I'm asking this again in the context of India. We are the largest democracy. We will have our demographics will be skewed across states. So in that context, what do you think? Do you think it still remains relevant?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because this is a question that has often been asked and debated upon also, particularly in the academic circles. Well, let me just point out a little matter of fact. When the Constitution of India was framed, the Rajya Sabha was framed before the Lok Sabha, 17 days before.
I see.
So Lok Sabha followed. And if you read the Constitution, you will always find it as Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha, never as Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. So the framers of the Constitution were very, very clear in their mind that they needed another house, which is known as a house to deliberate. Now, it may have got diluted, I don't deny that. And also the fact that there has been a change over the years, particularly, now, it's been good 7 decades, that there are changes that have occurred in the country, not just politically. I mean, political parties have mushroomed, coalitions, politics has come to stay, but there has also been a social change. And that social change reflects, and it does not necessarily reflect only in one house or the other house. Average ages, more or less, are there enough documentation on that. So there is an elderly component. The fact of the matter is that bicameralism provides precisely that safety valve where you need to actually ponder over things. And we've had so many examples over the years where delays, you may call it delays, but it's a second thought where you deliberate. That is why even in the Constitution, other than money bills, there are equal powers given to both. The reason for giving equal powers to both houses is for them to be able to discuss and debate. Unfortunately, we've added another, as the late President Pranab Mukherjee said, we've added another D to it, which is disruption, right?
Sure.
And what is actually causing people angst today is this disruption, because you're not being able to discuss. And that is precisely why bicameralism is important. If you didn't have bicameralism, you would not have had situations like even today where bills, for whatever it is being worth and criticized, being pushed through, not being pushed, there is a deliberative aspect of it which does exist in routine, like committees and places like that, where you do discuss things. So it's not something that I would say, in fact, I would say that a bicameral is a real necessity for a country of our size, diversity, and also for the need to be able to look back comfortably at these things. So I see that this is a very strong element of our democracy.
So you do feel that the essential principle that our founding fathers, or the people who was to actually stay above the fray and provide some counsel in some sense.
That is why you have the Vice President of India, who is the chairman. He doesn't preside over everything. I mean, a lot of it is delegated authority to the Secretariat, plus also the Deputy Chairman. But his sheer presence over there gives that elevated status to the Rajya Sabha to be able to see things much beyond, and also to be able to provide that kind of guidance. So therefore, I think, it's not, the framers of the Constitution did put a lot of effort into it. And I think there's no doubt in my mind that in our context, the bicameral legislature is a necessity.
Thank you for pointing that out. I was just curious to know. I just want to shift gears a little bit and talk to, I think, many students who, from our university, for example, who graduate out of our MA in development or in development studies very largely, and go and work in sort of challenging situations amongst people that they are really not very familiar with. So, knowing that you've been the chief secretary in the Andamans, how was it to serve as the chief secretary of that kind of a region compared to serving as a civil servant, not in the Andamans but in any other state? Was it in any way different? Because I was just curious, what is your experience like?
The Andaman and Nicobar are so far away from the mainland that people don't realize both its geographical significance and also in many ways its strategic importance. Now, it's the tri-command also, of all the three services. That's something that you don't get elsewhere in another state. In the state, you are in the four corners of a state with a particular sort of format, template, which binds you to thinking in that line.
Correct.
Now, this is a territory which is governed directly by the union. And it is governed directly by the union, keeping this thing in mind, not just its geography, but its strategic importance. So you have to actually look at it from multiple points of view. And added to that, there's a big sociological issue. You have the tribes, which anthropologically are, world over recognized, and to preserve them, and the ecology. And not just that, you also have a huge continental shelf that has to be protected. So all these issues, when they come across, it's a small territory, no doubt, but it has a tremendous significance. Also the fact that a large part of the world's shipping passes through that area. So you have to quite naturally interact with a lot of other issues that come out of that. And I went there at a time when it was traumatized because of the tsunami. You had a population which had lost people, every family. You had defense personnel who just got washed away. So the territory at that time was in a state of tremendous angst and a tremendous sense of apprehension. And at the same time, the goodwill that was produced from the mainland also created a false sense of, you may say, a kind of entitlement which people, you had to actually deliver on the ground, because it was not something that just people were just absorbing all that, but they had to also learn how to absorb it properly rather than misuse it. So with all those kind of multiple things working, and then of course working there was an experience in itself, because you had so many people wanting to help out that at one point of time you had to just say that just leave it, we will manage it.
During the tsunami time.
During the tsunami time, but the immense feeling of oneness, the immense feeling of camaraderie, and look at the way it boomed. Airline connections opened up, international traffic opened up, and I think, and it came onto the map of India in more ways than one. Otherwise, it was always known as Kala Pani. It was always known for the cellular jail. It was known as some out-of-way place. But today, its importance is fully understood, that it is not just a group of 530 islands. 530 islands is not a small amount. Of course, there are about 35 or 36 islands which are inhabited. But even 35, 36 islands inhabited. That kind of experience you only get when you're working, say, somewhere in
Indonesia or somewhere else. Yes.
No, even beyond, Micronesia, Fiji. So, those examples, and then you have challenging issues over there which you don't get at. For instance, water. Who would imagine that in a place like Andamans, one of the biggest problems is fresh water? So, you have literally one island that can give you fresh water, and the rest of it has to be managed. So, therefore, multiple issues come up. And then you have a population which has been rehabilitated there, partly due to British settlement, penal settlements, partly due to the Sri Lankan crisis, partly due to the Bangladesh crisis. So you have a microcosm of people from all over the region settled there, and ex-servicemen who were settled there. So, each one has their own culture, each one has their own, way of life. And then you really get exposed to that. And I think it's a very fascinating place to work in, and to, for any bureaucrat, I think.
Sure. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your experience in the Asian Development Bank, and what was the kind of stuff that you were doing, as part of your work in the Asian Development Bank.
Well, the Asian Development Bank is one of the leading multilateral banks, and India's presence has been there for a very, very long time, since its inception. And my role was, of course, very limited, because I was working for the executive director, who was on the board of directors. But the bank itself is a development bank, as it's called, Asian Development Bank. So it undertakes projects world over, primarily, of course, of its member countries, who take loans, who repay loans, and who undertake projects which are assessed on the basis of their impact. So one of the few things that we look at in that, whenever you sort of look at a project, is its impact. And today the word impact includes a huge area. Correct. Which starts off not just financial impact,
yes,
but you have climate issues, you have environmental issues, you have educational issues. And it gives you an exposure as to what else. And above all, I think what the bank provides is technical know-how. And you learn the best practices from others as much as they learn from you. So this whole idea of, I mean, like the World Bank does a lot of sectorial approach, the Asian Development Bank does sectorial approach, but it also has its eyes focused on projects. And therefore, with that background, the scope is very wide. And I think what it really does is it also keeps a togetherness because in the region, because it's a regional bank, so it keeps togetherness in the region. And to that extent, I think it serves a great purpose. And it, of course, at the time when we were there and maybe earlier, it also helped a great deal in the funding gap, because after all, funding has always been an issue. I mean, don't forget, when I joined the finance ministry in the Department of Economic Affairs, this was way back in 1990 to 92. That is the time when we had a balance of payments problem.
Correct.
And we had hardly $3 billion in our kitty. And today, when I hear people talking about $500 billion and $600 billion, your mind reels. You say, God, at that time we were struggling. And that is the time when multilateral banks and others held your hand and helped you out of that kind of crisis. So I think it's a give and take. And after all, you are an owner of the bank yourself.
Sure.
So you have a stake in that.
I mean, I didn't know that you were in the finance ministry in the 90s and
Yeah,
and
but
so
we went
you've
through the
literally
balance of
been
payments.
you joined in the late 70s, just almost post-emergency.
I was looking after bilateral assistance from the European countries
I see.
during the balance of payments problem. So, I mean, that
So
is
you were in the thick of things in
so
some
at that
sense.
time, we were living hand to mouth. We were
Yes,
living hand to
literally.
mouth. We had hardly money for about less than 1 month of imports. And of course, we had a very great team, Dr. Manmohan Singh
Correct.
and Monte Kaluwalia,
Mr. Geeta Krishnan, I think.
Geeta Krishnan, and Subbarao was there with me
Yes,
as
Subbarao was there,
a
correct.
contemporary.
Raja Chalaya was also there.
Yeah, so we had a great team, and the way people worked. And I also found that we had a great goodwill, because India has a kind of goodwill which today also we are building on. It's not that our goodwill just came from nowhere. The fact is that at that time, I think one of the greatest things which has gone unnoticed is that the then finance minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, and Mr. Chidambaram was the commerce minister, is credibility. I think one of the bases of for a bureaucrat, for a democracy, for anybody, is your credibility, right? And the credibility was that we would stick to our word, we would not default, come what may. And that is the credibility that has held us in good stead all these years. So the moment you lose your credibility,
Yes.
then I think you are in for serious trouble, whether you are a subdivisional magistrate or anybody else.
And that's a story yet to be told. I mean, there were many countries that I think took loans at that time, and
Yes.
but they've gone through their own throes.
We
of a
never
crisis.
defaulted.
Yes,
We never
exactly.
defaulted. We were ready to put our family silver at stake,
Correct.
but we never defaulted.
So looking back, I mean, you've been in the key moments, right, in public service. Are there any stories that you still remember?
Don't want to remember. Also,
Sure, but I mean, I'd be curious to know. I mean, this is a span that is so, expansive, right? From the 70s to now, you've seen so much of India, and an India that has really, really changed substantively, for good and for bad, right? In so many ways, from the 70s through the 80s, 90s. I'm just curious, what is it that remains with you, as a person of public service? Just what are some things that you could tell us?
well, I'm 70 years old, but I still feel young, okay, particularly in the university. But I would look back and say that my years that I spent with the two vice presidents, particularly the first vice president, Dr. K.R. Narayanan, who became president of India later, and I served him there also, first as joint secretary, then I officiated as secretary. So I went through that period which started with the Ayodhya movement and subsequent to whatever happened. And then subsequently, when he became, and then of course, the number of constitutional issues that came up. the crisis in states, Article 356, various states being sort of president's rule coming in, parliament getting, today we talk about disruption. At that time, this wasn't disruption, but it was really, I mean, you can imagine the kind of excitement that it sort of generated post 1992. Almost hardly a session went by without some kind of, temperatures being raised, the issues
Correct.
being raised, and then a fall of government, right? It immediately reflects in Parliament, whether it was a 13-day government of Mr. Vajpayee or it was. So I went through a period which started with Mr. Narasimha Rao and went through with Mr. Deve Gowda, went through with Mr. I.K. Gujral, and then with Mr. Vajpayee, and then with Mr. Modi. So, that whole span, there were a number of issues. They were, as I said, post 92, there were general elections, and very rarely did we have an occasion when we had back-to-back two general elections, 98 and 99.
Correct.
One after the other, fall of governments, and how the president had to play that out. And to top it all, we had Kargil. So
Yes.
the president is the supreme commander. So the Kargil thing. And in between all this, we tested our nuclear device. So that was such an interesting period of my career that, when I look back at that, and subsequently I went to the Asian Development Bank, that's a different story, why I went back to mainstream administration. But that period, you got to see the political democracy at work. And you got to see things where how the country stayed united in a crisis. The country has always remained united in a crisis. And that is what worries me today, that when I see things happening, that the strands of, you may say disunity, if you may call it that, I don't think so. But point is that the views sometimes people take, and I look back that at the time of our real crisis, whether it was the financial crisis, whether it was the political crisis, right? There was the post-Mandal movement after 1989 spilled over right through, or there were election representative issues, and there was a warlike situation with Kargil. In all these situations, the common factor was that there was not a voice which did not stand behind the government, irrespective of the government. And I just mentioned the various governments, United Front, Congress, BJP, all of them. So there is an intrinsic strength in our democracy. And it's that intrinsic strength in our democracy which should never be diluted. It should never be diluted through any means, whether you are doing it for limited gains of electoral purposes or whatever. It is that which is, I think, the biggest fear that one needs to have. And for that, institutions are very important. And the judiciary is a very important institution, which has survived all this. We may have whatever our views may be on the judiciary, but it has always been at the top of being able to balance things. And therefore, any part of our institution which is diluted, dismantled, or decimated, if I can use that word, whether it's the Election Commission, whether it's the judiciary, whether it is the executive, or for that matter, the parliament, would be the most disastrous thing for our democracy.
Yes, I certainly think that India has lived through several crises, and we've come out, I think, stronger than we have before, especially looking at our history over the past 30, 40 years. So I've been curious about one thing, Mr. Sheriff. One of the shows that I watch, one of my favorite shows is actually Yes Minister. And I'm just wondering, how close is Yes Minister to reality? You spent so many years. Is it really close to how things function in the government generally?
Well, I mean, you asked me a very broad question in government, so I don't speak for all governments, right? But I can't even speak for our government now that I'm retired. But the point is that Yes Minister is very real. I mean, please understand, the humor apart, which I think we have missed both in bureaucracy and in fact in parliament. There was a book that used to be brought out once every few years called Humor in Parliament.
Oh, I see.
Yes, and that has now been discontinued for whatever reason. But there used to be a book because the members of parliament can be so humorous. It's unbelievable, and how they put one another. But coming back to your question on yes, minister, please understand the way the issues are looked at and the way the reactions take place, the pressures under which a minister has to work, which is what I had said earlier, that unless there's a compatibility, unless you can tell your minister, that this is where the pitfalls are, and for that matter, don't forget there were times when the minister would ride roughshod even over the
Correct. I remember make
or
Mr.
the
Hawthorne
bureaucracy.
come running.
Yes,
Yes.
and tell them that listen, because don't forget, after all, in a political democracy, it's the politician who is the one who is actually at the helm of it. Okay, I agree that the constitution is supreme, not the politician, not the parliament. Constitution is supreme, but the bureaucrat has to, in fact, point out to the minister that these are the red lines of the constitution. As much as the minister can say that I am the one who takes the decision, right? Because I represent the people.
Correct.
So therefore, I think that aspect also has to be seen, not just the humor. So it's very, very real.
So bureaucrats have to think on their feet as much as the politicians, and every day is sort of
Continuously. There are any number of instances where if a bureaucrat doesn't think either positively or humorously, I remember when I went down to 10 Downing Street once, and I went into this room, and I was sitting there, and I was supposed to be the note taker, and I was sitting and taking notes. The Prime Minister of Britain there, and our team on this side, etc., etc., led by Vice President. I couldn't believe it. I said, this is the same room which I see all the time on Yes Minister, and in the bargain I forgot to take the notes. The Prime Minister of Britain noticed, and then I realized that, oh God, I should have been recording what he was saying. So, there are things. Similarly with P.G. Woodhouse. I mean, anybody, I'm sure there are also a lot of things in vernacular also. That is why in Parliament, if you follow the debates carefully, and that is why debates are so essential in Parliament, because, you get the flavor. I mean, I don't have to say people like Mr. Lalu Prasad Yadav in his humor could demolish any kind of argument, which is not just humor. It was real demolition of an argument or create an argument, So there's a lot to say for that,
I have two other questions. One is that the spelling of your name, which is Shumsher, spelled SH with a U, but it's usually spelled, from what I know, an A. So is that a typo in what we've got, or what's is there a story?
No, there's no typo in it. It's like most things in my life, very uncharted. Well, in the north, you always spell it with an A.
Correct, yeah.
So, but I'm partly from the south, but that doesn't justify it. What has actually happened, my father was a military officer, and my mother, when I was born, was very critically ill. So, in fact, chances of survival were very nil. So my father was very close friends with the exiled exiled Rana of Nepal, who was in exile here in India, in Ranchi, where I was born. So they, in fact, looked after me my initial sort of till my mother sort of recovered. So when I was to be named, my father asked them what kind of what. So the Rana said, well, he should have my name. So he was actually Padam Shumsher Jan Rana. So the Shumsher is actually a Nepalese spelling. It's not,
very interesting.
And in many ways it satisfied both my mother's family and of course my father's family too, because Shumsher can also serve, because my mother's from the north and my father's from the south. So it served many purposes. Harmony. The word is harmony.
I see. Well, such an interesting story to know that behind a small sort of difference in the spelling of a name. So, what are your plans now that you're beyond public service in some sense? What do you plan to do?
Well, after 40 years, I think you need retirement.
True.
Reflection. So I've taken up to sculpture.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So I used to sort of not dabble in school. And then I one day walked into the Triveni Art Gallery and I found a sculpture class going on. And I just tried my hand, and the man said that, listen, I think you've got it. Why don't you do something? So I joined them, and I do sculpture. I learn, and well, I've graduated slowly now.
I
And I
see.
do it in paper mache, and I started doing it, of course, clay paper mache, and I'm hope to now graduate to bronze, and preparing hopefully for an exhibition next year. And so
Wonderful.
as I said, well, you keep molding things. As a bureaucrat, you're always molding something or the other. So it's very satisfying, and you meet very nice people.
Sure.
And you sort of.
So at
interact
heart,
with-
you're an aesthete in that sense, right? You like things with the
yeah,
aesthetics.
no,
and
it's very satisfying. Very
So-
satisfying.
And so on that optimistic note, I hope we just on this 75th year of India's democracy, I hope more strength to our country and more strength to those people who, work through these crises, and for civil servants like you, sir. So I just want to sort of conclude by saying that, Mr. Sharif has had a very, very long, prestigious career spanning civil services, working in the legislature at both the state level and the global level, and I'm very happy that you came and visited us at the university. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.